Right. With that, let's also tell you how U.S. President Donald Trump has been facing political pressure in his own country as the Democrats have now escalated efforts to question his fitness for office. Well, more than 85 House and Senate Democrats are now calling for Trump to be either impeached or removed through the 25th Amendment. This move comes after Trump's recent remarks, including a whole civilization will die tonight, in a clear reference to Iran. Lawmakers have now introduced a striking proposal tied to the 25th Amendment, aiming to create a formal mechanism to assess whether Donald Trump can still serve. Under the proposal, congressional leaders will each appoint 2 members. It would include 4 former high-ranking executive branch officials, specifically vice presidents, secretaries of state, defense and treasury, attorneys general, and, of course, surgeon generals. The panel will include a final chair as well, selected by the commission itself, potentially a physician or a senior statesperson.
Guys, John speaking, you need to hear this today. April 7, 2026 was a defining moment. A line was crossed that cannot be uncrossed, fundamentally altering the trajectory of Trump's presidency. The specific words, responses, and legal arguments that day have been underappreciated, but their repercussions will echo through the remainder of his second term and beyond. On Easter Sunday, just one day before the explosion of removal calls, Trump posted on Truth Social that the United States would bomb Iran's bridges and power facilities. That is a specific threat against civilian infrastructure. Bridges that carry people and goods, power facilities that keep hospitals running and homes heated. Legal experts immediately flagged it as a potential violation of the Geneva Conventions because deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure.
But removing Donald Trump remains unlikely as this process requires the vice president, in this case of J.D. Vance, to agree with the commission's findings. Congress will then need a 2/3 majority vote in both chambers to make any removal permanent. Now, the 25th Amendment, remember, was formulated in 1967 after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. It ensures a legal mechanism designating a head of state when the president is disabled or dead. It also includes provisions for both voluntary and involuntary removal of a president. The 25th Amendment was used by George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan for medical treatment. Now, supporters argue this legislation is about preparedness and not politics. The proposal comes as the Senate votes on Wednesday to curb Trump's Iran war powers and ahead of the November midterms that will determine Trump's power in the final 2 years of his presidency.
Is something that international law treats with deadly seriousness, not as a legitimate military strategy, but as a war crime that carries individual criminal liability. That post alone generated significant alarm across the political spectrum. Major news organizations picked it up. International observers reacted with concern. Legal scholars started writing detailed analyses. But then, on April 7th, Trump went significantly further. He posted the words, "A whole civilization will die tonight unless Iran reopen the Strait of Hormuz. A whole civilization will die tonight." Those were the exact words posted publicly by the sitting president of the United States, directed at an entire country and its entire population.
And my colleague Susan Tehrani joins us live from New York at the moment to get us more on this. Susan, the Democrats, of course, upping the ante against Donald Trump as far as the Iran war is concerned. There is a lot of talk about the 25th Amendment being used. Get us more on how, now, of course, the opposition Democrats are planning to take this forward.
Yeah, this is just another, to be honest, blockbuster production brought to you by the same people that carried out 2 impeachments against the president during his first term, and then that January 6th commission that just dragged on, and an absolute nothing burger, for a lack of a better term, to waste everyone's time and resources. As you mentioned, the 25th Amendment was put forth in case a president gets assassinated, is sick, is injured. It wasn't put forth for someone to be removed from office because the other party simply doesn't agree with their policies. And as you mentioned, it's not only that both houses are controlled by the Republicans right now. The Democrats know this isn't going to go anywhere. But is J.D. Vance going to come on board? Is the president's entire...
Not a military target, Not a government installation, but a whole civilization. And the reaction from both sides of the aisle, from legal scholars, from foreign governments, from people who had actually worked inside Trump's own administration, was immediate, loud, and unlike anything we had seen at any point in this second term. Within hours of that post, more than 85 Democratic lawmakers in Congress publicly called for Trump's removal from office. Not criticism, not a stern statement of disapproval, but removal, impeachment, or the 25th Amendment. Over 70 House Democrats signed on. Multiple senators followed.
Our cabinet going to come on board? They have to come on board as well. So they know that this is not going to get anywhere, but unfortunately decided to take this course as opposed to more important issues put forth after they had a long recess for Easter. And the first thing that they did, they decided to put on something and put forth something that is absolutely not going to go through. So a lot of Americans are frustrated, understandably, right now. They want Congress to work for them, and they believe that because this is just absolutely, just unlawful in many ways, it's just going to be a waste of time. But it is going to, heat up the midterms and the conversation around that. So the Democrats are hoping they can change the conversation regarding that.
All right, Susan, thanks very much for joining us at the moment and getting us the latest.
The names included Senator Ed Markey, Senator Ron Wyden, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Representative Ro Khanna, Representative Maxwell Frost, Representative Rashida Tlaib, Representative Robert Garcia, Representative Sarah McBride. And then, in a moment that genuinely surprised a lot of political observers, former Speaker Nancy Pelosi added her voice. Nancy Pelosi, the person who has run Democratic strategy in the House through multiple Trump controversies, and who has historically been one of the most cautious voices about when and whether to pursue impeachment, came out and backed the removal calls. When Nancy Pelosi moves in that direction, that is a signal about something profoundly real. And then it got more bipartisan than anyone expected. CNN reported what it described as an eclectic bipartisan group suddenly calling for Trump's removal using the 25th Amendment. And when they said bipartisan, they meant it. Right-wing podcaster Candace Owens, who is not exactly known for aligning with Democratic priorities, posted that the 25th Amendment needs to be invoked. Anthony Scaramucci, Trump's own former White House communications director, argued publicly that Trump was threatening nuclear action and that the 25th Amendment was the appropriate response. Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker, who is being discussed as a potential 2028 presidential candidate, also called for the amendment's invocation. This was not a partisan pile-on. This was people from across the political spectrum, including people with direct experience in Trump's own orbit, looking at the words, "a whole civilization will die tonight," and arriving at the same conclusions independently. Representative John Larson of Connecticut went the furthest. He filed 13 articles of impeachment against Trump, accusing him of waging an illegal war and making escalating threats that endangered American security and American lives. 13 articles on the same day the civilization threat was posted. That is not a symbolic filing. That is a member of Congress putting specific legal charges on paper. And Senator Andy Kim stated it as plainly as anyone did. He said, "I certainly think the president should be removed. I mean, he is unfit for office." Not in careful hedge congressional language, just directly. The president is unfit for office and he should be removed. That is a sitting United States senator saying that out loud. And he was not alone. Over a quarter of Democratic members of Congress, according to New York Times reporting, raised concerns about Trump's mental fitness for holding the presidency. A quarter. That is not a fringe position within the caucus. That is a significant portion of one of the two major parties in the United States Congress questioning whether the president is mentally stable enough to hold office. To understand why April 7th triggered a response this large and this fast, and to understand why calling it unprecedented is accurate rather than hyperbolic, you need to understand the legal and constitutional context behind the specific words Trump used. Because this is not just about the political optics of an inflammatory social media post that made people uncomfortable. This is about what the law, specifically international law, constitutional law, and the war powers framework actually says about the kind of language that was used and what it legally implies about the actions being threatened. Words from the President of the United States are not just words. They are statements of official intent by the Commander-in-Chief of the most powerful military in the world. And the legal and constitutional standards that apply to those statements are specific and serious. The Geneva Conventions, which the United States has ratified and is legally bound by, prohibit deliberate attacks on civilian infrastructure. That includes bridges and power facilities. When Trump posted on Easter Sunday that the U.S. will bomb Iran's bridges and power facilities, legal scholars immediately pointed out that a deliberate threat to target civilian infrastructure as a military tactic could constitute a threat to commit what international law defines as a war crime. Representative Ro Khanna made this argument directly when he called for the 25th Amendment, saying that threatening war crimes is a clear breach of the Constitution and the Geneva Conventions. That is not a rhetorical flourish. That is a legal argument. And it is one that serious international law experts were making at the same time from outside Congress. Now add to that the April 7th post, "A whole civilization will die tonight." When you combine a specific threat to civilian infrastructure with a statement that an entire civilization will be destroyed, you are describing something that goes beyond a military deterrence message. You are describing the deliberate targeting and destruction of a civilian population. That framing, regardless of whether it was meant literally or as rhetorical pressure, is the kind of language that triggers mandatory legal analysis under international law and under the U.S. Constitution's war powers framework. Congress, specifically the House and Senate, has not authorized a declaration of war against Iran. The conflict was initiated by the executive branch without a formal congressional authorization. And the threats on April 7th were made by a president acting unilaterally, without consulting Congress, without notifying the relevant committees, without any of the procedural steps that the War Powers Resolution requires. All of that is in the background of why the response from lawmakers was as large as it was. Now let us look at the two removal mechanisms being invoked, because understanding how they actually work explains both why so many people are calling for them and why the calls are unlikely to produce immediate results, even while remaining politically significant. These are not interchangeable options. They work differently, they require different things, and they have different strategic implications for everyone involved. The first mechanism is impeachment. Impeachment requires a majority vote in the House to approve articles of impeachment, and then a 2/3 vote in the Senate to convict and remove. Currently, Democrats do not control the House. They are in the minority. So passing articles of impeachment through the House is not possible without significant Republican support. Representative Larson filed 13 articles, but without a House majority that can pass them, the articles are a statement of principle rather than an immediate legislative action. The political significance of the filing is real. It puts specific charges on the record, it builds a documented case, and it signals where Democratic priorities would go if they retake the House in November 2026. But in terms of actually removing Trump in the near term, impeachment through the current House is not a realistic path. The second mechanism is the 25th Amendment. This one is different and more interesting from a constitutional standpoint. The 25th Amendment, specifically Section 4, allows the vice president and a majority of the cabinet to declare the president unable to discharge his duties and transfer power to the vice president. Congress can then affirm that declaration if the president contests it, and doing so requires a 2/3 vote in both chambers. So invoking the 25th Amendment does not require a House majority vote to initiate. It requires Vice President J.D. Vance and a majority of Trump's cabinet to agree that the president is unfit, which, given that Vance and the cabinet are Trump's own people, is extraordinarily unlikely. The political dynamics inside Trump's administration make a cabinet-led 25th Amendment action essentially impossible under current conditions. The people calling for it, Candace Owens, Scaramucci, Ro Khanna, Ed Markey, all understand this. Their calls are partly legal argumentation and partly political pressure, designed to put the question of Trump's fitness on the public record in a formal way. And here's the part that Democratic leadership is navigating very carefully right now, and the part that rarely gets enough attention in coverage of these removal calls. The calls from over 85 lawmakers are real, and they represent genuine alarm at something that a wide range of people found genuinely alarming. But the leadership calculation, the strategic calculation, being made by the people who run Democratic messaging and legislative priorities heading into November 2026, is considerably more complicated than simply deciding whether the April 7th post was outrageous enough to justify a removal push. Reports indicated that since the conflict with Iran began, congressional Democrats have been calling the operation unconstitutional and challenging the war powers questions. But another impeachment has not seriously entered the conversation at the leadership level. The reason is political math. Pursuing impeachment in a Congress where you do not have the votes to succeed, and where a failed impeachment can energize the other side's base while exhausting your own, is a strategic risk that leadership has historically been reluctant to take. The question for Democratic strategists is whether the scale of the April 7th response, 85 lawmakers, bipartisan voices, former Speaker Pelosi, represents a threshold crossing that changes the calculus. What is genuinely new here, and what makes this different from earlier Trump controversies, is the breadth in the sources of the removal calls. When you have over 70 House Democrats, multiple senators, Nancy Pelosi, a former Trump communications director, a right-wing media figure, and a governor, all converging on the same conclusion on the same day, that is not a coordinated political attack. That is an organic response to something that a wide range of people independently found alarming enough to put their names on the record about. The New York Times reporting that over a quarter of Democratic members of Congress have questioned Trump's mental fitness is a number that suggests the concerns go well beyond the April 7th post specifically. That number suggests a deeper, longer-running concern about the president's judgment and stability that the civilization post-crystallized publicly. Congresswoman Yasmin Ansari, who has Iranian heritage, put the personal dimension of the April 7th post in terms that are worth taking a moment with. She was not speaking abstractly about constitutional law or political strategy. She was talking about a threat to annihilate an entire civilization. Her civilization, her family's civilization, the country where her roots are. And she argued that beyond the legal and constitutional questions, Trump's willingness to post something like that publicly, without consultation, without warning, as a unilateral social media statement, represents a fundamental and serious question about his mental fitness for the office he holds. That argument was not being made only by people with personal connections to Iran. It was being made simultaneously by legal experts, by former officials, by members of Congress from across the political spectrum, and by voices from within Trump's own political world. The convergence of that argument from so many different directions on the same day is itself a data point about what the April 7th post actually communicated to the people watching it most closely. And even when Trump announced a ceasefire later on April 7th, hours after the Civilization post, AOC made the point directly. The ceasefire changes nothing. The words were already public. The threat had already been made to the world. The question of fitness for office had already been formally raised by dozens of lawmakers. And in her view, Trump must be removed from office, whether by his cabinet or by Congress. That position did not change because a ceasefire was announced, because the issue was never just a ceasefire. The issue was the words, and the words were not taken back. The words themselves are the legal problem. Not the politics, not the tone, not the style, the actual words. A whole civilization will die tonight, and the threat to bomb bridges and power facilities the day before. These are not just inflammatory social media posts that cause offense and generate bad headlines and then get forgotten in the next news cycle. They are statements made by the sitting president of the United States, the commander-in-chief of the most powerful military ever assembled in human history, about actions he was presenting as both imminent and inevitable. The President of the United States told the world that a whole civilization would die that night unless a specific demand was met. That is not rhetorical pressure. That is a conditional threat of mass destruction stated explicitly and publicly. And the legal framework that applies to those statements is serious. Under the Geneva Conventions, which the U.S. is bound by, deliberate threats to civilian infrastructure and civilian populations carry specific legal weight. Under the War Powers Resolution, which governs how the executive can use military force without congressional authorization, the president's unilateral actions in Iran were already on contested constitutional ground before the April 7th post. And under the Constitution's framework for declaring war, which vests that power in Congress, not the president, the escalating threats made on April 7th without any congressional consultation raised the constitutional stakes significantly. When Ro Khanna says threatening war crimes is a breach of the Constitution and the Geneva Conventions, he is making a legal argument, not a rhetorical one. And it is an argument that a significant number of constitutional law scholars were making in parallel outside of Congress. The words are the evidence, and they are now permanently on the public record. The bipartisan element is what makes this historically significant. Every significant impeachment movement in American history eventually required some level of support from the president's own party to be taken seriously as a constitutional matter rather than a partisan one. The Nixon impeachment, which ultimately led to his resignation, built momentum precisely because Republicans began to peel away as the evidence mounted. What is notable about the April 7th response is not just the 85 Democrats. It is the non-Democrats who joined the conversation. It is Candace Owens, who has a significant right-wing audience calling for the 25th Amendment. Anthony Scaramucci, who worked in the Trump White House, making the argument about mental fitness. A sitting governor from a major state adding his voice. These are not people who instinctively align with progressive Democratic positions. These are people who looked at the April 7th post specifically and concluded independently that something was wrong. That convergence matters because it signals that the concerns about Trump's fitness and judgment are reaching beyond the Democratic base. And that has implications for November 2026. If independent voters and soft Republican voters are asking the same questions about the president's judgment and fitness that 85 lawmakers and bipartisan voices are raising publicly, that is an electoral dynamic that will shape competitive races in a very real way. The 25th Amendment discussion is more significant than it sounds. I want to spend a moment on this because it often gets dismissed as an unrealistic option. And that dismissal misses something important. You are correct that the 25th Amendment cannot be invoked right now. Vance is not going to call a cabinet meeting to declare Trump unfit. The cabinet members are not going to vote against their own president. That is not a realistic near-term scenario. But here is what the 25th Amendment discussion actually does. Even when the legal mechanism is not immediately available, it puts the question of mental fitness into the formal political conversation in a way that cannot easily be walked back. Once senators and representatives start going on record saying the president appears unfit for office, the question is, live in a way that affects how voters, foreign governments, and Republican officials think about the remaining years of the second term. Foreign governments that are already navigating Trump's erratic public statements now have additional context from American lawmakers about how those statements are being interpreted domestically. Republican senators who are already frustrated about the Iran deal, the same ones who called it a catastrophic mistake, now have to decide how to respond when voters in their states ask about the mental fitness arguments being made by 85 of their colleagues across the aisle. And Democratic candidates in competitive 2026 races now have a new and powerful line of argument to develop and deploy. The 25th Amendment conversation is not just about removal. It is about framing, and that framing has a long shelf life. This crisis does not exist in isolation, and that is the real problem for Trump. The April 7th removal calls did not happen in a vacuum. They happened as part of an accumulating set of crises that are all running simultaneously. The Iran conflict that Trump started in February without full congressional authorization. The multiple rounds of failed threats that have progressively weakened his negotiating position. The 24-hour deal reversal, where he announced a largely negotiated agreement and then walked it back within a day. The Republican Senate revolt, where key senators publicly called his Iran strategy a catastrophic mistake. The IRS lawsuit scandal, where he created a massive slush fund to pay January 6 defendants. And now, the April 7th removal calls from 85 lawmakers and a bipartisan collection of voices questioning his mental fitness. Each of these stories on its own is a significant political problem. Together, they create a portrait of a second term that is accumulating crisis faster than it can contain them. And here is the political reality that ties all of it together. The November 2026 midterms are the test that matters. Republican candidates in swing districts and competitive Senate races have to answer for all of these stories simultaneously. They have to explain the Iran deal reversal and the Senate revolt from within their own party. They have to explain the IRS lawsuit and the slush fund, and they have to respond to constituents who are asking, did the president really threaten to annihilate a whole civilization? And did over 85 members of Congress respond by calling for his removal? Those are not easy conversations to have in a competitive general election. And the fact that they are all happening at the same time, all compounding each other, heading into a midterm environment where Democratic enthusiasm and turnout are driven precisely by these kinds of issues. That is the broader political context that makes each individual story more consequential than it would be on its own. On April 7th, 2026, the President of the United States posted that a whole civilization will die tonight. 85 lawmakers immediately called for his removal. A former Trump communications director and a prominent right-wing media figure independently joined the chorus. A quarter of all Democratic members of Congress formally raised questions about his mental fitness for the presidency. 13 articles of impeachment were filed by a sitting congressman. And when a ceasefire came hours later, AOC said, "It changes nothing." The words had already been posted, the threat had already been made public, the question of fitness had already been raised. And the legal record of what was said on that day is now permanent. Whether or not Trump is removed from office, and the realistic near-term answer is that he will not be, because the constitutional and political mechanisms for removal require support he does not face. The April 7th events changed the political landscape of the second term in a way that does not reverse. The question of fitness for office is now a live, documented, bipartisan question. It is backed by specific legal arguments about war crimes and constitutional violations from members of Congress, legal scholars, and even voices from within Trump's own political world. It is on the record in 13 articles of impeachment filed by a sitting representative. And it is going to be part of the conversation in every competitive 2026 race in the country, because voters in swing districts and competitive states are now asking the same questions that 85 lawmakers put their names to on April 7th. That question does not go away, the words do not go away, and the November 2026 midterms are coming.